You operate under a massive delusion. You believe you are an independent agent. You think a rational mind presides over your life. But here is the brutal physical reality. You are merely a temporarily stabilized mass, a mass of rapidly decaying biological matter. This matter continuously hallucinates its own autonomy. You are entirely trapped within this organic machinery. Every thought is just a chemical spasm. Every choice is dictated by cellular decay. There is no sovereign self. A person stands in a brightly lit bathroom. They meticulously groom themselves before a mirror. Their facial posture displays complete relaxation. The steel razor slides across the skin. It nicks the jawline. A single drop of blood surfaces. Watch closely how they react. Instantly, their pupils dilate. The heart rate spikes by 15 to 20 beats per minute. A sudden, involuntary shudder runs down their trapezius muscles. They quickly wipe the red fluid away. They immediately sanitize the porcelain sink. They deliberately avoid eye contact with their reflection. This active avoidance lasts for exactly 45 seconds. Why does a singular drop of our own biological fluid trigger this? It instantly shatters the entire illusion of identity. It forces a violent physiological cascade, a cascade of pure dread and primal revulsion. What exactly are we so desperate to hide from ourselves? Human identity is a purely artificial construct. It is maintained through aggressive biological denial. We constantly reject our own physical reality. The brain works overtime to actively ignore the flesh, but sometimes we are forced to confront it. We see the gross, fragile mechanics of our organs. In that exact second, a critical psychological boundary shatters. The line between the perceiving subject and the physical object dissolves. The entire concept of the self completely collapses. The actual fatal mechanism is deeply neurological. It is governed by the anterior insular cortex. This region interacts directly with the behavioral immune system. The insular cortex processes primal, visceral disgust. Simultaneously, it generates your baseline sense of self-awareness. When you view your own bodily waste, a severe paradox occurs. Your brain physically splits into two conflicting realities. The somatosensory cortex registers the expelled material as self. It recognizes the precise biological origin of the tissue. But the insula instantly flags it as a severe, foreign pathogen. It demands you treat your own biology as a lethal threat. This creates massive neurological cognitive dissonance. The brain cannot resolve this internal biological contradiction. An acute, systemic stress response is triggered instantly. Cortisol levels in the bloodstream surge by up to 40%. This chemical flood aggressively attacks the brain's higher functions. It actively suppresses the prefrontal cortex. That is the exact neural region responsible for logical reasoning. It is the hardware that sustains your sustained self-concept. The mind simply cannot process the paradox. It cannot function as the observer and the rotting object simultaneously. Higher cognition literally shuts down under the chemical strain. A corporate executive sits in a high-stakes board meeting. They experience sudden, severe gastrointestinal distress. They rush into a bathroom stall and vomit violently. The physical expulsion of matter ends, but they do not immediately leave the stall. They stand completely frozen, staring down at the expelled fluid. Their breathing shifts to rapid, shallow hyperventilation. Oxygen intake drops as the diaphragm spasms. They physically back away from the porcelain bowl. They cross their arms tightly over their solar plexus. This is an involuntary, primitive biological guarding posture. They walk slowly toward the sink. Their gaze remains rigidly locked on the metal faucet. Their facial muscles go entirely slack and unresponsive. They actively refuse to process their own face in the mirror above it. This triggers the clinical onset of transient depersonalization. The individual plummets into a terrifying psychological void. Their perceived social status evaporates in milliseconds. Their intellect and personality completely vanish from their active awareness. These traits are momentarily recognized as pure fiction. They are exposed as a highly sterile coping mechanism. It is a fragile, psychological shield masking inevitable biological decay. The brain registers its own ego as a lie built over rotting tissue. The physical body is a horrifying, leaky prison. We spend our entire conscious lives desperately trying to ignore it. But what occurs when we cannot contain this disgust? What happens when we project this exact same biological revulsion outward? What if we map this decay onto the collective human body that surrounds us? The realization of our biological wretchedness does not stay contained. It rapidly scales outward into the external environment. This internal disgust transforms into clinical misanthropy. Misanthropy is completely misunderstood as a mere emotional attitude. It is actually a systemic, biological disdain for the entire human species. We observe the massive societal structures we have built. We recognize them as nothing but sterile, functional architectures. These structures merely organize our collective vanity, greed, and cruelty. The revulsion expands outward from the self to the entire population. The individual views the crowd as a diseased, unified organism. Humanity is permanently diagnosed as a fundamentally flawed mechanical failure. The actual fatal mechanism is rooted in primal threat detection. Misanthropy is a sustained neurological state of severe hyper-vigilance. It is entirely driven by violent amygdala hijacking. The human amygdala engages in highly asymmetric threat processing. It assigns vastly greater neural weight to observed moral violations. Prosocial behavior barely registers on this primal neurochemical radar. The brain requires a strict 5-to-1 ratio of positive interactions. Without 5 positive stimuli to offset 1 negative, baseline social trust collapses. Repeated exposure to humanity's structural failures triggers a secondary mechanism. The medial prefrontal cortex rapidly and permanently down-regulates. This is the exact brain region that governs human empathy and social connection. As empathy physically shuts down, the dorsal striatum violently activates. This region fires when the individual makes cynical, morally superior judgments. The brain literally becomes biologically addicted to the neurochemical reward of contempt. A commuter sits on a highly crowded, unventilated subway car. They observe a middle-aged man aggressively shove an elderly passenger. The man secures a plastic seat through pure physical dominance. Watch closely how the observing commuter reacts. Their masseter muscles involuntarily clench, locking the jaw. Their diaphragm constricts, severely restricting their oxygen intake. They make no physical move to intervene in the assault. Instead, they extract their smartphone with stiff, deliberate finger movements. They press the record button while maintaining a completely flat facial expression. The facial muscles display 0 micro-expressions of shock or empathy. They immediately upload the digital video file to a network. They attach a highly cynical caption detailing human degradation. For the remaining 30 minutes of the transit, they sit perfectly rigid. Their ocular focus is permanently fixed on the dirty subway floor. They actively treat the physical proximity of the other passengers as a literal biological contamination. This triggers the complete and irreversible collapse of prosocial behavior. The onset of total psychological and physical alienation begins. The individual does not simply dislike interacting with society. They become trapped inside an isolated, self-validating neurological loop. The brain requires a constant feed of systemic failures to justify its stress. The body physically withdraws from all non-essential human contact. The mind obsessively monitors the very species it entirely despises. The nervous system becomes a closed circuit of toxic validation. They are paralyzed by the continuous chemical reward of hatred. The external world is now conclusively diagnosed as an irredeemably corrupt and painful mechanism. There is no hope for systemic repair or evolutionary correction, and it gets worse. This terminal diagnosis forces a terrifyingly logical conclusion. A brutal, ethical imperative violently surfaces in the conscious mind. If the factory produces nothing but biological suffering, the response is mathematically obvious. You must immediately cut the power supply to the factory. The conscious mind demands that we completely stop feeding raw material into the machine. Biological existence contains an absolute terrifying asymmetry. Pain is a guaranteed physical metric. Pleasure is nothing but a fleeting neurochemical illusion. There is a massive, inherent imbalance in the sensory architecture of life. The only mathematically justifiable action is pure cessation. We must halt the biological replication protocol entirely. Human reproduction must be systematically stopped. This is not an emotional philosophy of despair. It is a rigorous, unavoidable ethical calculation. Preventing guaranteed suffering becomes the final moral imperative. The actual fatal mechanism occurs inside the rostral anterior cingulate cortex. Evolution engineered this specific neural tissue to actively lie to you. It systematically filters out negative statistical predictions. This creates a mandatory biological optimism bias. It forces the organism to continue breeding despite extreme environmental hostility. Antinatalist logic violently bypasses this neurochemical filter. It utilizes pure utilitarian computation in the prefrontal cortex. The logic reduces life to a brutal binary code. The presence of physical pain is objectively bad. The absolute absence of pain is objectively good. The absence of pleasure is entirely neurologically neutral. No uncreated being suffers from a lack of joy. Clinical psychology labels this exact cognitive state as depressive realism. Subjects process statistical probabilities of suffering with clinical accuracy. They operate entirely outside the brain's evolutionary delusion. The ethical equation becomes terrifyingly clear. Bringing sentient life into reality guarantees cellular decay. It guarantees decades of psychological trauma. Procreation is recognized as a non-consensual infliction of severe physical harm. Two individuals sit in a brightly lit genetic counseling office. The doctor presents a high-resolution sonogram. It displays a viable, genetically healthy embryo. Watch closely how they react. Neither partner exhibits any facial reactivity. There is zero contraction of the zygomatic major muscles. No smile is biologically generated. One partner leans forward slightly in the sterile chair. Their vocal cords maintain a completely flat, monotone pitch. They systematically list current environmental and biological data. They recite the precise statistical probabilities of clinical depression. They note the exact parts per million of microplastics found in fetal bloodstreams. They calculate the terminal oncology rates for the current demographic. They physically push the glossy sonogram printout back across the metal desk. The doctor slowly slides over the termination paperwork. The individual grips the pen with immense physical stability. They sign the legal document with smooth, uninterrupted strokes. They display a cold, rigid physical calmness. Electrodermal sensors would register zero physiological markers of grief. This act represents the ultimate biological rebellion. It is the deliberate termination of an unbroken genetic lineage, a lineage stretching back billions of brutal, competitive years. The species' most fundamental evolutionary directive is permanently severed. It is defeated by pure, cold, ethical computation. The DNA molecule is finally denied its next host. Reason successfully assassinate biological instinct. But here is the brutal physical reality. Humanity might successfully execute its own biological abortion. We might sever the human node from the tree of life, but does the grinding machinery of the universe actually power down? Does our absence freeze the thermodynamic engine of reality? Voluntary human extinction is the final delusion of the human ego. We believe our absence will somehow heal a broken universe. But extinguishing our specific primate species changes absolutely nothing. It does not extinguish the violent furnace of physical reality. The universe is completely indifferent to our moral boycotts. If humanity successfully phases itself out, the timeline simply continues. Organic life will continue to violently strive and mutate. Other organisms will blindly evolve, consume, and suffer in our permanent absence. The brutal physics of the food chain will not pause for a single second. You cannot reason your way out of basic thermodynamics. You cannot legislate against the grinding gears of evolutionary biology. Humanity is merely the only biological variation arrogant enough to believe this. We actually think our localized suicide could cure a cold, mechanical cosmos. You must immediately cease all passive fantasies of physical escape. Stop waiting for systemic eradication or a peaceful collapse. You are trapped here in this specific biological machinery. You must ruthlessly map your own existence within this system. When you inevitably experience cellular decay or psychological dread, observe it. When pain receptors fire, treat the sensation strictly as raw, objective data. Actively document the exact environmental inputs that trigger your neurological stress. Do not retreat into comforting psychological illusions or spiritual denial. You must build a meticulously curated intellectual framework. Use this architecture to understand your exact coordinates in this physical absurdity. You must utilize rigorous, high-density informational inputs. This is the only proven method to outmaneuver your own biological programming. You cannot navigate this brutal biological reality blind. You cannot rely on heavily diluted concepts to stabilize your nervous system. Cheap dopamine distractions will only accelerate your cognitive decay. You require raw, unfiltered data to survive the continuous sensory input. You need precise cognitive tools to process the hostility of your environment. Short-form provides the rigorous extraction of essential structural data. It systematically isolates humanity's most critical philosophical and scientific texts. It forcefully strips away the useless narrative noise. It delivers the pure, high-density information your prefrontal cortex demands. Click the link below to access the $50 discount and free trial. Begin constructing your permanent cognitive armor right now. See you in the next deep dive.